Hello, Global Theater. My name is Jerry Fielka. Today's Feb28, 2025. Want to thank Rob Grant and his amazing podcast, I'm Probably Wrong About Everything. Please subscribe. Want to welcome today's guest, Alfred Yun. How do you pronounce your last name, Alfred?
Oh, Yun, like moon, like Yun, like
Yun.
yeah,
And
yeah.
Alfred, where are you calling from?
I'm calling from Centerville, Virginia, Northern Virginia, right next to DC.
Centerville, Virginia. Wow, that's an amazing town name. Okay, what is the best thing for a human being?
The best thing for a human being. Wow, that is a difficult question. But this might be kind of cliche, but I think I have an interesting take on it, and I would say it's love. It's love.
Yeah. No, that's the answer I get the most, and it's evident.
Yeah,
Duh.
I think
That's fine.
so.
What's your favorite form of information? How it comes into you?
Books.
Yeah. Did you become a reader because your parents told you to read? Two, they did it as an example, or three, on your own?
It's like, if we're talking about origin, it's probably all of the above, including school. But I think the reason why it persists, I think it's because book reading gives you a different relationship to time in the
Yeah.
sense that, information, if you get it online now, it's quick, it's present. But books, you have to contend with the past, right? You
Dude.
have translation is built into reading, right? Because reading transcends time. You can be dead, but your writing can still be read by someone else even in the future after you're dead. And I feel like reading requires translation, reading requires and translation requires
Yeah.
understanding context, understanding history, understanding so many different things. And I think that's why reading is my preferred way of getting any kind of information, because it also it's more arduous. It takes time, right? It's a
Yeah.
struggle. And the best things in life come about through some kind of struggle. And I think reading, whereas a lot of things online are designed not to have you struggle, to be easy, right? Which
Yeah.
has its perks, but I personally, I've come to prefer reading as I got older, I think.
Dude, you covered the waterfront. We can just end the interview now. You touched you touched on every subject, but that was brilliant. You really articulate and concise. I appreciate that. Why do you think humans collect or gather information?
Well, it's because that's language, right? Language, because we speak language, and language is a system of symbolizing thing, representing and symbolizing things.
Yeah.
And and what are you trying to symbolize, right? You can call that data. You can call it, some linguists will call it, back then, especially way back then, some linguists would call it the signifier or the signified, whatever. We call it words, we call it data, whatever you call it. But I think it's a product of language if we're talking about compiling data. Now, if we were talking about experiencing phenomenon in our lives, like the tree is there or there's wind, that is just living, right? That life itself, you're already part of experience. It's baked into experience to collect and process information and data. But I think when it comes to compiling data as opposed to just merely experiencing, that's a product of language. Because language, like I said, with reading, transcends time. Language is infinite.
Really good. You're anticipating a lot of questions. You got ESP. The next question is this need or want to collect information more innate or more invented?
I honestly am not. I would push back against that dichotomy, because I personally
Yeah.
don't like, because don't understand what it means for something to be innate and for something to be invented in the context of what we're talking about right now in terms of
Yeah.
living in language, because that's like saying, like, I thought about something recently where, like an action isn't true or false. That's a false binary, because actions
Yeah.
are not true or false. Actions happen, right?
Yeah.
And I think, if we're talking about data and collecting data and experiencing, it's not a matter of inventing, or it's not a matter of innate. It just happens, right? And
Yeah.
and also what it means to exist is to be, to, like, for example, language, for example. Some people say language was invented, right? But in what sense is it invented? Is it invented in the sense that we made the iPhone, or is it a different kind of invention? For example, language is not like an iPhone, a tool, or actually, iPhone's probably not a good example because we constantly carry it. But like a chair, you're not constantly on a chair, but you're constantly in language. Language is not an invention that you can put down. Language takes you over. Language is all encompassing. Language takes over everything. Language processes everything. Once you enter language, everything that you experience is now processed through language, right? Even when you're not speaking a language, you think in language, and in a sense, it becomes innate, right? The dichotomy between the innate and the inventive kind of collapses, like when it comes to action, or when it comes to language, which is data, encompasses data collection and whatever we're talking about. It's something that was invented at one point, but once it's become invented, it becomes innate.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
That's what I mean.
No, you mean you again, you articulated it very concise, and I appreciate it because it's like Monk, the guy who brought us together, because your great video on Monk on YouTube is, did he, it's a false dichotomy in a false binary, you say. And of course, all these questions at the beginning, is it more this or more that? Well, of course it's both, and it depends, but it's really, these are just prompts to get you to talk. And
Right,
so
right.
you don't have to answer the question, but the ultimate question for me with Monk is, did he get it from his parents' DNA a little more than his environment or his dedication? Or we can't tell. There's no way you could
Yeah.
ever tell. Or your skill as a pianist, did you get that a little more from your parents' DNA or a little more from how they raised you? I'm not asking you the question, but I agree. And all my questions are, you don't have to answer them. You put them into the context you want. And I'm for people saying, I don't know, I can't answer that, or let me change the words in your question. So
Yeah.
that was really good. Do thoughts create emotions?
Um, Thoughts happen,
Yeah.
and emotions happen too.
Yeah.
I don't think they can be interrelated,
Yeah.
but I don't think it's I don't think it's a matter of creation. Like, I mean, you, like, anybody who's meditated knows you can't
Yeah.
stop thinking. That's the point of meditation, right? It shows, like, literally, you can't stop thinking. You think about not thinking constantly while you're meditating,
You're
and that's what.
quoting a line I use in about you're directly quoting. I say
Right.
people who meditate say, now think about not thinking. Okay, fill in the blank, Alfred. I don't know what I think until I.
Um, until I think about it, until it's
Yeah,
unt until retrospective, I think. It's always,
until I retrospect on it. What's
I
the verb?
retrospectively interpret it. Until
Interpret it.
Yeah.
Retrospectively interpret. Okay, because McLuhan says, I don't know what I think until I say it. Joan Didion says, I
Yeah.
don't know what I think until I write it. So
Mhm,
that
mhm.
was good. Retrospectively interpret. Very good. Here's the question you anticipated. Can humans think without language?
Not when we're talking about the particular type of thinking we're talking about. If we're defining thought as we usually define it, you know, X leads to Y, your words are able to. No, I don't think so. Not
Okay.
not not usually. That's not when we refer to thinking. We're always talking about linguistic. Some kind of language is at the basis, you know. But
Okay.
maybe you can say if you think animals think, that's a very different type of thinking. Then maybe, but that's not usually what people are talking about when they
But
say,
that's anthropomorphizing the word on animals. They,
I,
they never came to us and said, we have a word that's thinking and it's like yours.
no, no,
There's
no. I'm
Yeah,
I'm not saying that they don't have, they can't reason or have rationality, but I think what I'm trying to say is that the word thought is so steeped in context and history and an
right. Yeah,
anthropomorphized way of describing it, that
yeah,
trying to say it is something else when that really is the only thing we're really interested in when we're asking that question.
yeah,
Usually it's, unless, that's why I'm using the other context to see. In those contexts, then we start breaking away from it. But in most contexts,
yeah.
when we're saying thought, we're talking about linguistic thought.
You're
In
you're you're really smart because Chomsky says language is not just words. It's
No.
a culture, a tradition, a unification of community, a whole history that creates what a community is. Alfred, what do you do when language doesn't work? When language breaks down, what do you do?
That's life. Language breaks down all the time. That's what language is, right?
Well, what do
Language.
you do? Like you're at the store and the clerk and you can't seem to get on the same track communicating. What do you
um
do?
I mean, that's maybe you can um step back and think about it if we're talking about more practically. But if we're talking about it at a broader level, language can never capture um what it's trying to describe.
Yeah.
That language can, but it's the only way we know how to think or do anything. So I think it's not just a failure of language to not be able to describe something. I think it is a key feature of
That's
language
it.
that
It's the
that it
reason.
can't describe, that it often fails. Like failure is baked into the system of
Yeah,
thought, is the
yeah.
way I think about it. And that's why it's productive, because when something, because it's not complete, it produces things. It creates
Hello.
new things. It makes new connections because it's not
Yeah,
complete, right? That's and
very good. Are
yeah,
you your
yeah.
your observations of humans in general, are we more feeling beings or more thinking beings?
Um, I can't really tell the distinction between the two,
Yeah,
because what does it mean to think without feeling? What does it mean to feel
yeah.
without thinking? I don't
Yeah,
really know what that means.
that's, Bridget Bardot. This is where you anticipated that line. Bridget Bardot says, "When I make love, I don't think." And I'm like, "Good luck. How do you turn your brain off?" Or people who meditate.
She probably,
People people who meditate go, "I'm thinking about not thinking."
you're
So
right.
there's a bumper sticker on a car on my street that says, "Don't believe everything you think." And I'm like, well, you could say, "Don't believe everything you feel."
Yeah, yeah,
But
yeah,
we invented the words thinking and feeling, so we think we can separate them.
yeah,
That's the
yeah.
problem.
Yeah, yeah, I don't really know what it means to really separate them, because they both just happen to you,
Yeah,
You're not really in control of them in the way that we talk about it as if we're in
yeah,
control of it, like we're like there's like a puppet in the theater here and it like
yeah,
controls things. But I mean, just meditation shows you you're not in control of it.
yeah,
It thought, like the production of thought is ongoing all the time. Maybe the way you try to experience that production,
yeah,
that's what meditation does. You focus on the breath, and you're not constantly in your thoughts,
yeah,
identifying with your thoughts as they occur to you. That
yeah,
can happen. You have control over that, but you don't have the control over the production of thought. Thought is constant. It just happens.
yeah,
And I think emotions are kind of the same thing. Like you can interpret the way you feel something as you get older, but that's what maturity is, right?
yeah,
But you're gonna feel like you're always gonna feel.
yeah,
Like even a simple example, you literally cannot live if you cannot feel. I mean, like a very basic example, hunger.
yeah,
You will be satisfied, but it will never last forever because you have to
yeah,
live. You have to
yeah,
constantly feel hunger. You have to constantly feel sleepy. You have to constantly feel to be productive, to do thing, anything, to live. So it's never gonna stop. It
right. And
and
then
I think,
y
yeah.
we have the imagination, Alfred. to, like I say, well, we're probably hardwired or it's in our DNA to eat food. And then there's these people who are called breatharians. So you brought up the word breath. So can they literally survive by just breathing? Yeah, right. I believe that. But the fact
Uh,
that humans thought it up and talk about it, then it exists. Here's two questions from Alan Turing in the 50s. One, is thinking a function of the soul?
um, it depends on what you mean by soul. I don't know if you can tell, like, like I read a lot of philosophy. That's what I studied in school before I studied music. So like thinking, for example, in philosophy, it's a really loaded word. And soul, for example, that's like, what do you mean by that? It's like, do you
But
mean in the
Alfred, me and you kind of know, we can look it up in Wikipedia or a dictionary. Soul means blah blah. We kind of know. Your hunch or your guess
okay, okay.
is thinking a function of the soul. Yeah.
Well, I think for Turing, because I'm aware of Turing, because he
Yeah.
was very influential in talking about intelligence and machine intelligence and all these things. So, and artificial intelligence and all that, which is very influential in philosophy too. What he's talking about is thinking something that is unique to a material body who has a consciousness of this kind. And maybe he might also be talking about, is there some kind of puppet in the theater of our mind? And if we're talking about that, um then no, because I don't believe in a soul. I don't believe a
Okay.
soul exists.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
yeah,
Okay.
not in that sense.
The second Turing question is, can machines think?
No, I don't believe machines can think.
One more Turing, because you're so dang smart. I'm going to give you a bonus Turing. He said, what we want is a machine that can learn from experience. So is he saying we as scientists, or is he saying we as humans? And what do you think of that line? What we want is a machine that can learn from experience.
Well,
Any
he's reducing experience is the key word there, because what do you mean by experience?
Yeah,
Because is a machine does a machine experience like we do? N-
yeah,
n- do they they collect data? We collect
yeah,
data too. That's similar, and
yeah,
that's what prompts their questioning. But they don't move around experience
yeah,
with the like, for example, our desire, like, let's talk about desire, feeling that we talked about earlier. Machines, does it's coded into, like, the desires that a machine has, which, if you want to call it a desire, it's coded into it. It's cyclical, whereas our desires, scientists like to talk about, like, the DNA is some kind of code, but the DNA itself, a lot of scientists found later, is we don't really know what the fuck that thing is. Like, epigenetics kind of shows
yeah,
us, what are we even talking about?
yeah,
When DNA determines us, like, we
yeah,
don't really know what a DNA is, what it
yeah,
does to full extent, to say with such certainty that it codes everything in life. I mean, yeah, it is very
yeah.
obviously, seems to be very important, but I'm getting sidetracked a little. But I think
That's good.
it depends on what we're talking about. It means it matter. It depends on what you mean by experience. And
Yeah,
our experience seems to run like language, for example. It seems to have, like, failure, incompleteness is baked into the system, whereas
yeah,
an AI is always already complete. Even if
yeah,
even if it's if like, the better AI systems try to be open to interpretation and things like that.
yeah,
But that's not what we're doing. We're not open to interpretation. We are interpreting, and
yeah,
we fail, and we die. And also, another thing is AI. It's there's choice, in a way,
yeah,
for AI. For, like, experience is somebody's choice for AI,
yeah.
whereas experience is not our choice. you
Well, this,
you you
yeah,
experience before you think.
yeah.
You experience before anything. Like, you're
Well,
thrown in,
that's,
like the existentialists say, you're thrown into the world. It's not the other way around. You don't throw yourself into existence. You exist in the world. When you
yeah,
open the door, you just open a door because it is already assumed that there's a door, that you
yeah,
can grab it, that you can open it. you don't think about it. Like an AI would have to calculate all of the things that is involved in opening a door. That's not how we experience opening a door, isn't
Yeah.
it? No, we just do it.
Yeah, you're really also, again, I'm saying you're really smart, because one thing I majorly study is called effects precede causes. And when you said experience before you think, that's it. And George Lakoff, neuroscience, the
Yeah, 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 yeah.
cognitive behaviorist, says we're operating 90% unconsciously or subconsciously.
Yeah.
But I'm for, you said sidetrack. I'm for sidetracks. I'm for anecdotes, stories, tangents. So feel free to go on those, because here's the word experience in a quote by Marshall McLuhan that I want you to tell me what you think about this after I tell you what I think about it, because I might
Sure.
be wrong. But
No,
here it
let's
is.
do it.
Everybody experiences far more than they understand. Yet it is experience rather than understanding that influences behavior. So it's like the kid comes in from the cold and the parent goes, "Don't touch the stove, it'll burn your hands." That's experience. The parent could say, "Let me teach you the dynamics of heat. This is understanding that you can go up to the stove, rub your hands really close to the stove, and get your hands warm."
Yeah.
So I think he's kind of saying that we should have understanding shaping our behavior more than experience. Now, I can read the quote to you again, or you can just go off on however you want.
That's an interesting, I think for me, at least the way I think about it, it goes back to kind of what we're talking about with thought, right? What is
Yeah,
it what is thought? What kind of
yeah,
role does it play? Now, people like Descartes thought was everything. Thought, thinking
yeah,
preceded, you know, it, material body. It was the essence. Now, a lot of philosophers broke away from that, and one person that I think who had an interesting take on certain aspects of this debate is Hegel, where Hegel talks about truth as retrospective. Like I was
yeah,
saying earlier, truth is something that we do afterwards. And also Heidegger, who's another philosopher, he talks about how, when you actually observe the way we do things, when I open the door, for example, I am not calculating all of my steps and consciously thinking about my hand as it touches the door. You just do it. Thinking is something that happens after. Thinking is quite rare, and that accords with what your quote was saying. But one thing I personally would push back on is the notion of agency, where we have to fight back that aspect of us and come to own ourselves and own our thoughts. But how can you do that when thoughts happen to you? You don't own your thoughts.
yeah.
How did your thoughts come to you?
No,
You
that's,
don't you you
that's,
don't co- you don't control you don't control your thoughts. You don't you know
yeah. Well,
um
let me interject really fast, Alfred. That is Frank Zappa asking the question, who are the brain police? He's not saying the brain police is the voice inside your head. He's not saying the brain police are the consumer culture outside your body. He's saying, who are the brain? He's just asking the question. And you
yeah.
bring him up, Heidegger was perfect, because McLuhan was the one who said, we're surfing Heidegger. He used that term surfing before that hit the internet world, way
Yeah.
back in regards to Heidegger. So that was good. Do you more pursue happiness or more pursue meaning?
Well, at least according to my definition of happiness, and also I think it's my definition of love too. That's why I mentioned it earlier. Um, I It depends on what you mean by meaning, but I think they're kind of the same thing.
Yeah,
That's what do we usually mean when we're saying I want to do something with meaning? It usually means
yeah,
I'm spending time with someone I love. I'm doing something that brings me love and joy and
yeah,
purpose. Which will always involves love at a certain extent. Oh, and which always involves happiness. Like a really deep kind of happiness. So I don't really know. I can't
well,
really
Viktor Frankl,
distinguish the two.
Yeah, I got it from Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning. And I'm curious your thoughts on this. He says happiness doesn't tend to last, meaning tends to last.
Well, it depends on how you look at happiness.
Yeah,
Like is happiness that feeling that we have when we're
yeah,
satisfied, or is happiness a structure?
yeah,
That's the question Wittgenstein asked about
yeah,
love, because what Wittgenstein found in is that when people say love, they often invoke the notion of true love. But if love is a feeling, how can love be true or false? Because feelings aren't true or false, they happen. But the fact that you are saying something is true or false means you're talking about something different. Is that love is
right,
not a feeling. Love is something that can be
right,
true or false,
right.
because it is a structure that we can look at. It is a structure of your
Yeah,
affection with somebody. What kind of patterns and
yeah,
prolongment of affection do you have with this person that we can later judge retrospectively, look at, which is truth, which is always retrospective. You look at it and you determine, well, yeah, this fits the criterion of love and this
yeah,
doesn't. That's the only way we can make sense of the word true love, because it has to have, if it's just a feeling, something in the moment, then we can't talk about it as true or false, right? Because what do you mean a feeling is false? It
yeah,
happened. It's not
yeah,
even a matter of true or false.
yeah,
It's not a criterion. It's just something that happens. Whereas, and I think happiness is often similarly talked about in terms of people say that's true happiness. That's not true. That's false happiness. Well,
yeah,
then we're not talking about feelings anymore, are we? We're talking
yeah,
about what kinds of patterns and patterns of happiness across time that we retrospectively look at and go, okay, I think that was true happiness, right? it's
yeah.
his it's So happiness is history.
Happiness just,
Love is history. it's
yeah,
not
really,
it's not mathematics. That's what I
yeah,
think.
really good. Like Monk said, math, music is math. But does the brain more detect consciousness or create it? Like, is consciousness there bubbling away and we're more so detecting it or more so creating it?
Well, consciousness is another really, complex topic. I don't think we create consciousness. I think consciousness happens to us. We
Yeah,
exist in consciousness.
yeah,
I don't think, like, there's no master in the theater, and we're controlling it. I don't think
yeah,
consciousness is something we control. It's something that happens, right?
yeah.
That's the way I think about it. But consciousness is like, that's a huge topic. That's like
What's
huge.
what's faster, speed of light or speed of thought?
Um, well, probably speed of light, I guess. But, um, it also depends on what you mean by fast, right? If we're
Yeah,
because those 2 can't be compared, right? Can you measure the speed of thought? Um, what do you mean? At what point does thought begin and non-thought begin? You know what I
yeah,
mean? Like that's a different question. Whereas speed of light is something that happens in the physical world, and the way we define it is something that we are somehow able to measure. Whereas thought, can you measure thought? I mean, scientists will probably try to, measure based on your reaction time or some kind of signal in your brain, which is related to thought. Obviously, is correlated, but you can't actually measure thought itself because it's intangible, like art, like love.
yeah.
And intangible things are real, but they're not real in the same way that material things are real. But I don't. But so you have to talk about it differently. And
There's you brought up the word tangible because this next question is that I'm talking about tangible and non-tangible. Audre Lorde, the poet, said, "You can't dismantle the master's house using the master's tools." Her colleague Yvonne Rainer says, "Oh, you can if you expose the tools." What new tool do you suggest?
um, well, it depends on what you mean by the master. And it depends on what you're talking about. But let's talk about, for example, if we're talking about the world, then that's not true because you can only exist in the world, right? You can't not use the world because that doesn't make any sense. But if we're talking about more artificial systems like a house, like she's talking about, like that's probably depends on what you're trying to do, right? And what the state of the house, the state of the house, right? It Because I don't think it's necessarily true that, for example, if we're talking about political systems, Karl Marx talks about how his vision of communism arises from capitalism, right? Whereas some later interpreters of socialism or communism, or just people who are influenced by him, but neither communist or socialist, they might look at things a little differently depending on how you're looking at it and your perspective. And it can be the same thing about about music, right? We can talk about in terms of chord, like the tuning system we use, or the 12-tone tuning system. Some people think we need to get the heck out of that. We've been using that system for too long. It is constraining us, and there is no more interesting things we can do from that. We need to start exploring all the other pitches in between the 12 notes. And whereas some people seem to be pretty creative even after hundreds of years of using the same 12 notes again and again, which is a pretty significant limit, right? And a pretty but I don't know, it depends on what you're talking about. Like Igor Stravinsky talks about how limit often produce more creativity for him, and I think that is often true. But I also do think some, like, for example, the example of a house. What if the house is the wood of the house is so rotten, and it's a house made out of wood, and we can't use any of the wood? Then is it really right to talk about reusing the materials of the house to create something new, right? If what we're looking for is to create a sturdy house made out of wood, right?
Yeah.
Now, if your aim isn't to create a house, but to just burn some wood to cook a steak or whatever, then maybe you could use that wood, right? It depends on what you're talking about.
You got to be strong so you can go find some new material to make another house. But
Exactly, it depends on what you're
here's the
talking
thing.
about.
I'm glad you brought up Marx, because I rarely bring this quote up, and it's really reductive. But Marx basically said, we're here to change the world. McLuhan said, dude, Carl, you can't change diddly squat. Your tools change you. So the question really is, bare bottom, what tool do you most gravitate towards, whether it's tangible or not tangible?
Well, I actually I'm familiar with that quote, and and I'm familiar with Marx, because he's a significant philosopher. And I would I think Marx is not actually as simplistic. If you look at his broader work, he often talks about something similar, right? He looks at capitalism as some kind of false tool that gives us certain things, but isn't giving us some things that will probably be good for us, right? So he is talking about tools too. But yeah, I think I think I wouldn't even say tools. I actually would go more towards what Marx is saying. I wouldn't say it's a tool. I think it's the other way around. It's like thought. It's not something you use. It's something that happens to you. You are in the tool. So you're the cog in the tool. So what you're trying to change is the system. You're trying to change the house.
The system, yeah.
Yeah,
So
that's what I think of it as.
Yeah, because
and I agree that it's not, yeah, that you have to change the system, not yeah. But but I disagree with the analogy of the tool, because I think it's a tool is subservient to us, whereas I think it's the other way around. We're subservient to the system.
Yeah, this is a really good point, because this is what Churchill said: we shape our buildings, then they shape us. And McLuhan brilliantly just reworded it and said, we shape our tools, then they shape us.
Which I agree, yes.
But to understand Marshall, you have to understand when he says tool, whether he's saying TV or information gathering or non-tangible, philosophy is a tool. We invented it. Okay, that we invented the word philosophy. He's saying the environment that the tool creates is what he's about.
That's the system.
That's the system. You're right on there perfectly. Okay. Now, what new toy do you suggest?
Um, I'm old school. It's solidarity. It's community, solidarity, and that's the only way. That's the only
That
way out.
is amazing to say that as a toy, because I asked the tool question, and then one person went, "Well, what about a toy?" And so I says, "Well, now I'll ask people after the tool question, I'll ask them the toy question." Most people wouldn't say, "Oh, solidarity and community is a toy." But
Well,
what do you wait, let me just finish. What do? You play music. You
yeah,
don't work music. That's why music's the ultimate art form,
that's
because
a
you
great
play
point.
it. So
That's
go
a great
ahead. Yeah.
point. That's what I
Yeah.
mean is that,
Yeah.
like for a child, because when we're talking about toys, we're really talking about for children, and a toy to a child is not just a mere tool. That is the world. That
That's
not only
right.
is you play not only do you play with it, it creates
Yeah.
a whole nother world. It
Yeah.
create it manifests an entire reality upon yourself when you're a child playing with a toy. So it depends on what you mean by a toy. If you're
Yeah.
looking at it from an adult's perspective, oh, that's just a toy. But if we're bringing the element of play in it, and who actually plays with toys, it's children. Yeah, I think the solidarity and the community part, to me, I think it fits
It's it's
nicely because, yeah,
it's
from a
amazing.
child's perspective, a toy is everything. It
You would
changes everything.
Alfred, you would love this guy. He's like a great harmonica player, and I think he taught philosophy at Notre Dame for 40 years. I says, "What new toy do you suggest?" He goes, "Well, when I'm walking down the path with my grandkids in the woods, it's whatever they pick up next."
For sure.
Yeah. And so which is funny, because I think we had to reschedule this podcast because you recently had your first child.
Yeah, I did. I
How
did.
how old is your first child now?
Oh, she's 10 months now. 10 months now. Yeah.
10 months. Wow. And what is her name?
Yuna is her name.
That is so cool. So, congratulations. So, what do you worry about when you go to bed at night?
Oh, I'm an anxious person, so I worry about everything in my life. Um, but I've been working on an album, and that's it's an all-encompassing process of mixing, thinking of promoting and booking, more practical thoughts
Yeah.
sometimes. But sometimes, like the other day, I was reading an article by philosopher and theorist Todd McGowan, and he was talking about Derrida and how his work relates to how his interpretation of Hegel, and that was kind of interesting to me, and not just because of some superficial reason of like, oh, like, I want to read about, but like, that like they're talking about the things we just talked about, like
Yeah.
thought, how they
Yeah.
relate to each other, like systems, and they each have their own interpretation. Derrida has an interesting interpretation, and Hegel has an interesting interpretation, and he was trying to argue that Derrida had some of it right, but because he didn't see it in this way that Hegel did, that he got something wrong. But
Yeah.
it was interesting. So it depends on the day, man. It depends on what I'm thinking about. But honestly, it's usually I'm just anxious about work. that's that's
Well,
usually what
thank
I'm anxious
thank
about.
God you can make your living being a musician and a composer and an educator. That's all the power to you, because
Yeah,
that's a big task.
yeah.
McLuhan learned from the poet Ezra Pound that artists are the antenna of the race. They're broadcasting and detecting the hidden psychic effects of our inventions, so we might be able to cope with what we don't like about our inventions. So, Alfred, I asked you the question Marshall probed his whole career. Why do we ignore the hidden psychic effects of our inventions, even though the artists are broadcasting them to us?
Well, it's how do I say it? It's that's an interesting question, and I think I have a thought, but I'm trying to formulate it. I think it's because it has to do with the way I think desire functions. So
Yeah,
the way desire functions, and this is going to relate to what we're talking about, is that you have to want something that doesn't exist, and you have to forget about it. that it
Yeah.
doesn't exist. You know, for example, hunger, you know, what is actually going on in our minds is that there is some kind of entity that will satisfy us and make us whole, right? Now, there are moments of satisfaction. You eat, you know, your sandwich and you're pleased, but you'll never stop desiring, right? You're going
Yeah.
to keep desiring that something that's going to satisfy you again and again and again, and you can't become privy to the fact that that thing doesn't exist. And
Yeah.
that's the point, because that's how you keep waking up and eating and doing things, that you can't actually get the thing that you want, because the thing you want is purposefully doesn't exist. That's how you design, that's how we designed it, you know, or
Who'd you learn that from, Alfred?
this is you know, this is from the school of thought of like Zizek and Todd McGowan, who
Oh
dropped out.
my God, Zizek.
Freud and
Oh,
Lacan,
well,
you know,
Zizek is the world's greatest Marxist Freudian. No, Lacanian from
Lacan, yeah.
yeah,
Who's a Freudian? Who's a Freudian?
It's
You know,
yeah, Freudian, but Marxist Freudian McCon. And I've had it out with Zizek twice, like on the street talking to him.
oh,
Because
that's awesome.
he's a Beckett guy and I'm a Joyce guy, and he's very interesting. He can talk McLuhan too. But I'm glad you brought that up, because it's really intense. It says how desire functions. We want something that does not exist, and we can't forget about it,
Yeah.
thinking it will exist. Let me ask you if that corresponds to Chris Fuller told me last week, that what he says, I've heard that consciousness is the stowaway on the boat, and we don't know that the stowaway is on the boat, guiding the driving the boat. And so it's the stowaway in the boat driving the boat, and we don't know that the stowaway, we think the captain of the ship is driving the boat.
Yeah, and that's this, and what's really interesting, I think the really interesting part is not only that we can recognize that we're not in charge of things, that our consciousness, there's no master, you know, controlling the puppet in the theater, but it feels like it, doesn't it? It feels like we're the ones in control.
We feel like we're in control.
And why is that? You know what I mean? Like that's the important question. Why is it important for us to experience in that way? There has to be something, and desire is one part of the picture, is that you see that in order to keep producing desire, there has to be an emptiness. Now, what about consciousness? Why does consciousness have to be shaped in a way that it gives the illusion that we are fully in charge of everything, even though when you actually dig into your real experience, like meditation or things, you see it's like you are not in control of producing your thoughts. They just freaking happen to you. So
but that's
but it feels like I'm creating my thoughts.
No, the feel thing is good too, because that's the most watched TED Talk ever, is Fake It to Make It. So we're faking like we know that.
No, actually, I disagree. I disagree. It's faking, because it's not fake. You don't even have the control to fake it. You don't even have enough control to fake it. It's happening to you.
I'll reword it. It's a genuine fake.
Yeah, exactly. You are not faking it. You know, you've got to be in control to fake it. We're not faking it. We're not in control. It's just happening to us, and we feel like we're in control.
You know, Church of the Subgenius, they say, pull the wool over your own eyes.
Yeah. Well, actually, the way I would say it is, instead of pulling the wool over our own eyes, is that we had the wool over our eyes the whole time, and that's the only way we can see. So when you take away the wool and you actually see the world, you're traumatized.
Yeah.
And you put the wool back on, and that's the only way you can see. That's the way. It's more like sunglasses. You know, the world is so bright. You take the sunglasses off, you can't see anything. So you got to put the sunglasses on. And it's not even a choice. The sunglasses are molded into your head. They're your lenses.
Okay.
Molded into your head.
Yeah, really good, Alfred. That was epiphany. Do artists have moral obligation?
Yes.
Yeah.
insofar as anybody has obligations
Yeah.
to the wider community, yes.
Yeah.
But but I wouldn't say moral, because moral usually to me is more oftentimes thought of in a more religious or individual context. And
What word would you put there then?
I think usually when someone says, "Do artists, a large group of people, have a moral obligation?" They're talking about something bigger. They're talking about political obligation. They're not just talking about, do you have an obligation to pick, like if your neighbor falls, do you have an obligation to pick them up? That's nice. That's a good thing, but that's not what we're interested in when we're asking artists, do they have a moral we're talking about politics, right? Usually we're talking about politics and political obligation. Yes, I do believe we have
Wow.
political obligation. Yeah.
Are you more afraid of new ideas or more afraid of old ideas?
I'm afraid of old new ideas. You know what I mean by that? So what I'm afraid of is, like, if you watch Hollywood, they if you look at the way they portray the future, which vision of the future is it? It's a future that people thought of in the 50s. You know what I mean? So it's a future, it's new, but it's old. And that scares
Yeah.
me, because what that shows us is that we can't actually create new visions of the future anymore. We just keep rehashing old, lost futures because we don't have the capacity to create new futures, right? I mean, this is something by Zizek, and I'm copying him again, but I think it's brilliant. Is that he's not the only one who said this, but it's that our movies, the world is always ending in the movies. But you know
Yeah.
what? You know what doesn't change? Politics never changes, because we can't imagine it. We can imagine the end of the world, but we can't imagine the change to our systems,
Yeah.
because it's more permanent than
It's
the
really
world itself. I mean, you look at it. I mean, what is climate change other than the system overrunning the world itself?
yeah.
It's literally, and yeah, and I think that concerns me a lot more than almost anything. It's old
Yeah.
new ideas. That
Old new
old
ideas.
new ideas really scare me. When
See,
people
that's
keep
what
saying the same
yeah.
shit, of same vision of a shitty future that they
Yeah.
thought of 70 years ago,
Yeah.
and they still think that, younger kids are still thinking that, younger kids are still listening to the same music in the same way.
Duh.
It's
That's
scary.
Star Wars came because he wanted to remake
Right.
some sci-fi film, and then he decided to go Joseph Campbell on us. So listen, that was Samuel Delaney, the sci-fi writer. My friend said, what is the golden age of sci-fi? And people go, the 20s, the 30s, the 50s, the 60s. And he says, no, it's when you're 11 years old.
I
And but here's where my new and old idea question came from, because I didn't even open the question with the cute quotes like I do sometimes. I just asked the question and you anticipated and knew the quotes. Check this out, John Cage. I
oh
can't
yeah.
understand. I can't understand why people are afraid of new ideas. I'm frightened of the old ones. and then and then Charles Kettering said, people are very open-minded about new things as long as they're exactly like the old ones.
Yeah,
So
and
you really, you have a deeper, what I'm after is going a little deeper, like a deep sea diving. Like
huh,
everybody has their surface answers, but then can we go deeper and discover new epiphanies? So can you conjure up your earliest memory ever, or one of them?
that's a I don't really know what's my earliest memory. I think
Well, just
probably
one of them. Yeah, one of them.
it's probably one of the earliest memories is when we were living in Philadelphia, because my parents and I was born in Philadelphia, and then I lived here for a couple of years, and then I went back to Korea with my parents, and then I came back to the US when I was a teenager. And my earliest memory was when I was in Philadelphia. My parents were struggling, and we were living in someone's second floor, like someone's house,
Yeah.
and we lived in the one room in the second floor, and I remember it was very uncomfortable because there was a family downstairs just kind of going about their life, and whenever we came home, we had to cut through them to go up into our room,
Yeah.
into our small little room in somebody's house upstairs. And I think that's probably my earliest experience, is feeling uncomfortable and not having a home.
Only child?
No, but I am 5 years older than my younger sister. So
Two kids, yeah.
yeah.
Okay, so then, is memory more a curse or more a blessing?
Um, I don't think again another one of those things. I don't think you can really
Yeah,
put it into that, because I don't think you like, if we're talking about curse and blessing, what we're talking about is trauma. Is it trauma, or is it the things like love and happiness that keep
yeah,
us going? But neither of those exist without memory.
yeah,
You know what I mean? They
yeah,
can Both of them can only exist because they're compiled in language, in memory, you
yeah.
know. So it's,
Tell
in yeah, so I don't know. I don't think you can have either. Or I
Yeah,
don't think it's an either or question.
yeah,
It's just part of
yeah,
language is traumatic,
yeah,
but it also is the ultimate bliss,
yeah.
you know?
Tell me someone within your immediate family who had an impact on you, and what specifically was that impact?
Um um there are many, but I think my uncle, who raised me when I came back to the US when I was a teenager, he had a negative and a positive impact on me. And the positive impact is that I was a very disorganized child, very chaotic, still quite disorganized, because, um, but he gave me the tools to organize my life. So I'm the most disorganized, organized person in the
Yeah,
world. Like, in my immediate circles, everybody thinks I'm organized, but
yeah,
I'm not actually organized. I'm fundamentally chaotic. I'm ADHD, so I'm an ADHD, fundamentally disorganized person
yeah,
who had to discipline himself, undiagnosed, no
yeah,
medication, until his adulthood, because I wasn't diagnosed until I was an adult. I had to deal with those shortcomings until I became an adult. And I only got through that by grit and discipline that my uncle taught me. But that came with a cost, is that he tried to change me, and he tried to make the things that are natural to me as bad things to frown upon, right?
wow,
While giving me the tools to deal with them better. So he was a positive. I mean, he's an enduring influence. He shapes the way I am, because I can only function and be organized and efficient despite my condition, because of him. But also because of him, I had to do, I like I said, I'm an anxious person. I got into a bad habit, and I'm starting to get out of it, of really beating myself up, because I could
yeah,
not focus or do anything unless I beat myself up, because that's what he taught me, right? Is that
yeah,
you have to
yeah.
discipline, and but it also helped me survive. Like,
Yeah, yeah. No, that's
it's one
you're
of those things.
it's you're anticipating the major thing McLuhan learned from Joyce is how do you turn a breakdown into a breakthrough? That's how do you turn a weakness into a strength? But we'll talk about that. So now the same question, Alfred, outside your immediate family, someone who had an impact on you, and what was the impact?
That's a big question. By immediate family,
You put it into the context you want, whatever. Outside your family, someone who had an impact on you.
well, other besides my wife, who I kind of consider to be still my immediate family, especially nowadays. But when we weren't married, I probably would have mentioned my wife. But if we're gonna talk about, um, so I honestly, I think it's, to me, it's been, it's not a person. It's the to me, the thing that taught me the most is surviving your own hell.
Yeah,
Your own hell that you create through your anxieties, through your, you know, demons, and surviving from that.
Well, who do you see doing that? Was Monk one of them? Because didn't he
Yeah, I mean, I would say, yeah. I mean,
I mean,
Monk.
he wasn't I mean, in my opinion, he wasn't a mental case, but it's like Nina Simone too. They're like, oh, we found out she was bipolar years later. It's like, give me a break, just because you got a label. I know, Monk does these things, and maybe was he ever diagnosed?
I don't know. I mean, he probably was neurodivergent, as we say it now, because he was different in a lot of ways. I mean, just watch an interview of him. He doesn't speak and act like a typical person, even though I wouldn't say he's,
Yeah,
he's he didn't seem like someone who wouldn't fit in. That's the difference. I think he figured out a way for himself. Yeah. And his
yeah,
music is that struggle, right? Because his music is quirky. It's weird, but it's also like that's why I love his music. But it's also not so alienating to the point that people can't, just like he was. He could
yeah,
be around people, even though he was a little weird. He could
yeah,
still function around people, and people,
yeah,
he had a lot of people who were around him who were attracted to him. Um,
yeah,
and I don't mean, and and where, but and I think his music reflected that.
yeah,
It's a little weird. It's not like, as a jazz pianist, it's not like the other bebop songs but it's also not so away from the tradition that it's unrecognizable, but it is so noticeably weird. He's in that weird valley where
yeah.
it's not a small quirk, it's a pretty significant
Yeah,
quirkiness
but
there.
I don't I would contend weird carries a little negativeness, but I'm the history of weird influences. I know what you're saying, but I
Yeah.
have to tell you this because I do want to get into music. We have a few more philosophical questions, but I have to tell you this before I forget is one of the greatest artists in Venice, California, who I've talked about music for years with, said Monk heard all the notes Charlie Parker heard, but only decided to play some of them.
No, I think that describes a lot about Monk. He chose to do things differently. I
Yeah.
and you can see that they were deliberate. They're always, and I don't know what, and I keep saying the word weird because that's just that I
No,
don't
I
really
know.
know. I think
It is
quirky. Quirky is,
quirky and weird are good, but it's
you know,
like yeah, it's like what they put on Zappa too. Oh, you're weird or quirky. He says, I'm just normal. I'm just
yeah,
doing this stuff. And then these
yeah.
aesthetic gatekeepers want to name this. That's all right because I mean, is Albert Eiler and Ornette and Sun Ra weirder than Monk? I mean,
I wouldn't say so. I would say they are more radically different from the tradition of bebop and the
yeah,
music that came before than Monk was. But and that's why I keep using the word weird. That's not really weird. That's then another group. They have taken the music to
yeah,
another
yeah,
vocabulary. It's like another language. It
yeah,
comes from the same roots.
yeah,
It's a Latin based language, for example. It's
yeah,
Spanish, and maybe they're going towards French. They're related, but they're starting to form different communities. Whereas Monk is someone who's using Spanish in a really strange way that
yeah.
others don't. You know what I
Right.
mean? He's
But
still
Ornette,
Spanish. He's
Ornette
not going
came,
towards French,
yeah,
but he
yeah,
is
no, that's a good
like
good analogy. But
he is
Ornette,
starting to use Spanish in a way that people are like, "That's a weird way
yeah,
to do that."
but
You know?
but Ornette came out of King Curtis. And
Yeah,
so did David Sanborn. It's like, oh, yeah, like I know he's good, but I kind of hate his sound. But I
yeah,
love Ornette coming
yeah.
out of
He's
King
good.
Curtis. But anyways, what you said, we'll get into music. Okay, now, did your parents raise you a particular religion?
Uh, Not really. They are, I would say, they flirt with Catholicism because Catholicism has a pretty um
Yeah.
progressive bent in Korea. In South Korea,
Oh, in
um
South Korea, yeah.
in South Korea, Catholics often, not always, but often tend to be not conservative politically. So they and they and they fought against like the Japanese occupiers sometimes and helped like the democratic movements. So I think they are kind of attracted to that and they
Yeah.
formed some communities with them. But I don't, but they don't go to church every week. You know what I mean?
Oh, Alfred, do you pray?
No, I don't pray.
If God exists, what would you like God to say to you after you die?
If God if God exists, then if there is a God, I think there's the God is the failure of the world. You know what I mean? And I don't mean that in a negative sense. I mean that
Right.
in like a joyous sense. Is
Yeah.
God is the glitch. Like reality is like a video game, and God is the glitch that happens that we see when things get fucked up, when things don't make sense. That to me is God. And
But what
so
would you
I
want?
wouldn't say anything. I would laugh. I would
You would
laugh.
laugh, yeah, but you wouldn't want that entity to say anything to you.
No, because that's not God. God doesn't say anything. You know, God shouldn't say anything.
Nothing. So what you're saying, what do you want God to say to you? Nothing.
Yeah, I just want to
Yeah.
laugh, you know?
Okay, that's good. I like that. Do evil people exist, or does evil use people as a vehicle?
Ooh, that's an interesting question. I think I am more usually towards the latter if we're talking about politics. Yeah.
Yeah.
If we're talking about politics, we're talking about the latter, I think. Um and
Okay, the real question, though, you can suss it out this way. How do you advise someone to deal with an enemy? Let me set it up. Alan Watts says, if you acknowledge your enemy, you empower them. Coppola stole from the mob of the samurai. Keep your friends close and your enemies closer. JFK says, forgive your enemy, but don't forget their name. And Fellini says, I need an enemy. So it's a lot of thoughts. The basic question is, how do you advise someone to deal with an enemy? But first, how would you respond to Alan Watts? If you acknowledge your enemy, you empower them.
um it depends on what you mean by enemy.
Yeah,
So if you what you mean by enemy is the fantasy in your head that is causing you all this harm, kind of like desire, that thing doesn't exist. That's a
yeah,
fantasy. So yeah, if you're acknowledging and concretizing that fantasy in your head, yes, that's
yeah,
you're empowering it. But I do also think the other way in that there are real antagonisms in the world. It's just the fantasies in our heads that we like. For example, I don't like Donald Trump. For example, I don't like Donald Trump, but I don't. Donald Trump is not the enemy. He can be an antagonistic element of the enemy, but the enemy is the system that keeps
yeah,
that keeps producing him,
yeah,
right? That keeps that. So there are structural enemies,
yeah.
but are there actual like people who once you get rid of them, all of your hostilities and problems that they cause you will disappear. That's a fantasy. And and it's kind of like the fantasy of the fact that you have control over your thoughts. It's a mechanism, I think, to keep having you going, I guess, to
And
get
yeah, but that's funny because if your daughter comes home from school when she's, 8 or 10 and she goes, "I'm being bullied," what advice would you give her?
Well, there are, we got to talk about different levels, right? So there's a there's a structurally correct level of analysis you can put there, which is that usually or that bullying is a structural problem because it keeps getting produced in many different settings, whether it's in Korea, Japan, America, whatever country and whatever timeline. If it keeps getting produced, that's something that is structured into the way relationships and things work. So you have to address that, right? In a larger context. But in a personal context, I'm gonna be pissed off and I'm gonna want to beat up that kid, right? And I think that's and they're I think that they're both true. Is
Yeah,
that it depends on what you're talking about because the
yeah,
latter is not about me actually beating up the kid. It's about empathizing with my daughter.
yeah,
It's about indulging in that fantasy that this kid is the problem together because it makes us feel better. And there's nothing wrong with indulging in fantasy. It exists for a reason. But we do need to acknowledge that a fantasy is we do need to have the capacity to acknowledge that a fantasy is a fantasy.
Yeah, that's good because you anticipated. Nassim Taleb said games were created to give non-heroes the illusion of winning. In real life, we don't know who wins or loses, but we can tell who a hero is. My friend says, well, villains don't think they're bad. They want control. Heroes want freedom. Gregory Bateson says if the criminal gets caught, does he go, whoa, my criminal skills weren't up to snuff that day? Or does he go, oh, I did something morally and socially wrong? So again, it's a lot of prompts, but the basic question is, does punishment work?
Generally I say well, yes and no. It works in the sense that it does produce certain predictable behaviors. For example, like it works in the sense that yeah, it does deter people, right? It works. It obviously works, but does it work in the way that we want to?
Yeah.
Probably not.
Yeah.
If we're actually talking about getting rid of the fundamental reasons as to why certain crimes occur and how to rehabilitate them and how to and all those more, all those kinds of things, no. Punishment
Yeah.
doesn't do that. But it does work. I think it works in the sense that, guns kill people. Yeah,
Yeah.
it will kill someone,
Yeah.
but so can many other things. And how do you this is kind of getting brutal, but I'm not trying to kill someone, but you can skin a cat many different ways. It depends on what you're trying to get at, what you're trying to get, right? And punishment generally, especially the way we practice punishment at an institutional level, I don't think it gets the effect, the results that we see are good for society. But it does work. It
Yeah.
works. I mean,
Yeah.
it operates.
Well,
I don't think
Joyce,
it's good.
yeah, James Joyce was the first projectionist in Dublin 100 years ago. He basically checked out. He said, this is stupid. Why should I go inside a building and see a movie of a tree when I can go outside and see a real tree?
Yeah.
Years later, Faulkner said sometimes the best fiction is more true than journalism. Why
Yeah.
do we have to recreate things in order to get them? Why do we have to go to a theatrical play of people acting out life? Why don't we just live life?
Well, life. This is difficult question, and I think it's because um, life is interpreted. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Is that um, life is different from thought, but thought is the way we interpret life. You know what I mean? And because life is interpreted, we're going to interpret it through symbolism, as we do in art sometimes, as we do in language if we write it down, as we record it in our thoughts. Yeah, it's just part of something, because that's how we make sense of the world, right?
Yeah.
Is that because if we only lived and we didn't interpret, we would have no memories of the kinds that we're talking about, where we have a narrative of who we are, what kind of personality we are, where we came from. We would literally be like, food, go. Tree, go. Water, pee. That's what we would be if we didn't have language and thought. And that's life too, and that's a very important part of life. But we're obviously have another capacity, right? We that's another fundamental aspect of the way we experience and live is interpreting, right? And art is probably one of the greatest forms of such interpretations.
Yeah.
And it's
So
interesting. I mean,
well, let's go into that, Alfred. What's your tipping point where you said music is my calling? So you're in Philly, then you're in Korea. You come back to the US as a teenager. What are you listening to? All that pre, you know, like college time that where are you going? Oh, am I going to learn an instrument because my parents told me to, or I picked it? Where's that tipping point where you realize music is your calling?
it was the only place I could escape. I think. It was the only place, because it was really difficult for me when I came back to the US. It was the only place I could actually escape to somewhere. And I think I was very escapist before, because before I got into music, I was serious about becoming an animator and a comic book artist. That was my calling because I was escaping into that world all the time. But then life got a little too hard when I was a teenager. It was really rough for me. My uncle was very strict. I was constantly getting yelled at. I came back to this country. I don't really speak the language. And we're talking about the 2000s America, when, um, not so long after 9/11, where people were didn't I mean, people don't like brown people still, but like they didn't it was a little different back then, like I didn't see, like, if you go on TV, Asian people on TV were just like these weird caricatures, nobodies. Not saying I like Asian people on TV now, but it's a little bit more human now. They're
Yeah.
more variety now than there used to be. And I came into a hostile world, a hostile house, a hostile adult, and a hostile environment. And I was also hostile to myself because I'm a teenager, and teenagers start doubting themselves. So they're starting to develop a hostility towards the previous way they saw and interpreted things. I had hostility coming from all fronts, and comic books, animation just didn't do enough for me. Whereas music emotionally was just it was just so much more powerful. It just had a power that is so much more direct and immediate. You get to that emotion immediately, whereas a comic book, you have to build up the world and then identify with the characters, and it takes time. Whereas I think what I needed I need a quicker drug. I
Who
needed
was
something.
the what was the format you were listening to, and who were you listening to? Live musicians, or
Oh,
did
I
you
was
get
mostly like MP3, like a teenage kid. I was
like
listening to a lot of
who?
I
Who
was
was
listening to a lot of hip hop. I was listening to a lot of pop music, but the people that lasted, even people who I listened to back then, that still listen to, because I don't listen to a lot of that music and I can't even remember all of it, was Seotaeji was a Korean pop artist. He was, but it's kind of a disservice to just call him only a pop artist. But
yeah.
he was a very very controversial figure in Korean pop music because he he upset a lot of people. He mixed genre because he was a heavy metal musician who later got into hip hop and dance music. And in Korea, you your education level determines a lot of who you are as a person and how people judge you. And he didn't even graduate high school, I think, or I think he stopped going to school when he was young. He was a rebellious kid who
Alfred,
didn't.
spell his name for me.
I think in English they spell it as Seotaiji, and his best music are the first four albums he made under the group Soteji and the Boys. He has a lot of good stuff afterwards too, but the
But
first four albums that he
yeah,
made.
that's cool. Now, but are you going, oh, that's what I want to do? Where's that tipping point? Like, did you pick your instrument, piano, and they go, that I want to pursue music? And it's also
Yeah, yeah,
where did
yeah.
philosophy come in? Did you go, okay, I'm going to go to college for music, or I'm going to go to college for philosophy, and then what?
Well, well,
It started the
I'll talk about all this.
yeah,
That's a lot. Yeah, but so let's talk about music first. Is
yeah,
that and it's I Soteji and also Monk nowadays more recently, but also back then I think he was great, and then he became pretty crazy lately. Is Kanye West, I think, he was
yeah.
another really big influence when I was young. And Miles is really big, especially when I was in college because he was like the first gateway. But Monk, Soteji, oh, Serge Gainsbourg, he was also
Oh yeah.
really really big. Serge Gainsbourg was probably the biggest musical influence out of all of them. But
Wow, that's
yeah,
heavy.
because I studied him really deeply. But the music, like all of them that I'm starting to notice as I get older that they share, and the part that I really like is that one part is that there's kind of a no nonsense aspect to it. You know what I mean? They dare to say things. They dare to say things, right? And when I was young, I think I felt like I couldn't really say what I was feeling because I felt like I was in a hostile
Yeah,
environment everywhere. And they just said it, right?
yeah,
And that was one thing. And then I think another part that I really loved about their music, and Sotteji also um embodies this too, so does Monk, and so does Serge Gainsbourg, is that they're so multi-dimensional. Like
yeah,
Sotteji was a pop artist, but on he would release like a heavy metal song criticizing the Korean education industry, which is like that's like criticizing the military in this country. You know, that's the biggest entity in Korea, and he was shitting on um the education system. And as the most popular pop artist, you know, and like actually getting censored by the government. But then he would also write a pop song, you know, and then he
yeah,
would also write like a hip hop track and a ballad. And they were so multi. They were like they gave me so much life because they brought
yeah,
me all aspects of life, and you know, and they were speaking their mind honestly without any bullshit, but also elegantly too.
yeah,
Not just no nonsense bullshit, but it's like trivial. It was elegant, deep,
yeah,
risky, no nonsense music
yeah,
that that yeah, and I think that was what was so interesting to me. So my new album actually has a pop song and a freaking free jazz heavy metal song, you know. So it's I'm just a disciple, you know, but
that's
and
good. But are your parents saying you've got to learn an instrument, or you go, I want to learn an instrument? Where did that come in?
so
Like
they I learned the piano for like 2 years when I was a kid,
by
and
your
then
choice, or they picked it?
they picked it, and then I
Okay.
stopped.
Yeah,
And then they stopped it because they were like, "I don't think he's interested." And then when I started getting into when I started getting into music, when I came back to America, that's when the piano was the only thing I had
yeah,
that was the musically, and I sang a lot too. Unfortunately, never got better, but piano, it did get a little better. Um, and I just played by myself for a long time, and then I went to college. I went to Berkeley in Boston, and that's when I got my butt kicked because I was this self-taught pianist who really knew nothing. So I was 24, 25 when I went to Berkeley, I think. And that's when I had to learn the piano when I was in my 20s. And I had to catch up to the kids who've been playing piano at a high level their entire lives.
yeah.
And somehow I think I'm actually caught up more or less. You know, nobody thinks I learned the piano at 25. Um, but you know, so maybe there's but you know, but uh, yeah, but a lot of it was self-taught. But philosophy came in when because I was mostly interested in writing songs with lyrics when I was young.
I
I
see.
didn't discover jazz until I was 21 or something. I didn't even really know jazz. Like I
Yeah,
didn't really if someone told me to tell you what jazz was, I didn't really know what I
yeah.
would, you know, I would give you like, you know, Questlove or something, you know, like I really didn't know what jazz was when I was young.
No,
So
Eric Andre. No,
yeah.
yeah, because he's probably in your class. But it's funny because you're at Berkeley. Then did you start studying philosophy
No,
after
no,
Berkeley, or
philosophy was before. Philosophy was
be-
before.
before
Philosophy
Berkeley? Okay,
philosophy is when I also started studying Serge Gainsbourg.
yeah,
Is that I looked at my lyrics and they were all just these teenage angsty love songs
right,
because I was a teenager. And then
yeah,
my uncle, who disapproved of almost everything I did, the one thing that he thought was good that I was interested in is like when I was in high school, they were teaching us philosophy. They were teaching us Immanuel Kant. And I was like, what the
yeah.
fuck is this dude saying? Like this is like what in the world? Who the fuck talks like this? Like what is this craziness? So I brought it to my uncle and my uncle's eyes lit up. And he told me all about it. And I was like, "Oh, it must be something interesting if he's that and
If
that's
he
when
liked,
If
Yeah.
he likes it, and when I started getting interested in it, my uncle, that was one of the first only things that he approved that I was interested in. And and philosophy itself just ended up being really interesting genuinely for me.
Yeah.
And it I noticed that I wasn't writing teenage pop songs anymore. I was asking more interesting questions about the world when I
Yeah.
started like deeply studying, like really diving into philosophy.
Yeah.
Um,
No, your
yeah.
lyrics in the outside of a woman, the lyrics are really beautiful poetry.
Oh,
So,
thank you.
Alfred, a screenwriting teacher told me great art is when you can clearly see the intention of the maker. Kubrick
Mhm.
says the opposite. Great art is when you can clearly not see the intention of the maker. What role does intention play in your creative process when you're writing an Alfred song? No commission. When you're
Yeah.
writing a song for yourself, what role does intention play?
Yeah, for me, it's paramount.
Yeah,
It's in my process. That's the best way to put it because I not all intentional music isn't the only great music out there. I recognize that. But personally, I have come to realize that my process I enjoy is the intentional part and that's what I'm good at and that's just been my process because I spent so much time doing it by myself
yeah,
that that's what I realize because like by intentional is that like I like for example the outside of a woman, let's talk about that song for example. The lyrics are talking about the outside, right? The lyrics are talking about something that's the features of a woman that are outside and I'm trying to um challenge the binary between the inside and the outside, saying
yeah,
someone's inside thoughts are more of who they are rather than their outer appearance. But what I'm trying to say in that song is that that's not true. What you say outside, what you actually express, your skin, your hands, your actions, the color you choose for your hair, your outside says just as much about you as your inside. There is you can't distinguish the two.
yeah,
And the way I write that the melody is that I use notes that are outside of the scale and I use chords that are outside from each other, overlapping each other the whole time. And you know and that's and you know
that's
and
good.
then because the story there's like a progression to it, a climax, so I deliberately designed the melody and the structure of the song to kind of climax at the end because
Yeah,
not all songs. So I tend to be more of an obsessively intentional composer. Like I will not only some songs I will not only like every aspect of my music has to serve the purpose of the song.
yeah,
It's not about sounding pretty for me. For some people, it's about sounding pretty and it sounds great, it's beautiful, and it works for them. For me, I have noticed I am not satisfied in my personal process and journey as an artist until like if I wrote a song about censorship. So it's called Meta's Narrative, and that is a melody that I wrote out and I got an eraser and I started erasing certain
yeah,
parts of the melody
good.
until it became a different melody,
Yeah,
and I shortened it too. Not
yeah,
only did the melody get shorter, the length of the chords got shorter.
yeah,
Everything, the way the melody, the harmony, the length of the harmony, everything had to fit that notion of censorship of Facebook and things. That was
it's,
one song I wrote
yeah.
for
It's like
for
what you have that clip of Bill Frisell saying exactly that. Like, taking out the notes.
yeah, yeah.
Everybody plays too many notes. That's, you know, yeah,
Yeah.
George Clinton said it best. Funk is the absence of. But we'll get into that. The follow-up question to the intention is, Duchamp said there's no art without an audience. How much do you think of your listener when you're writing your song?
Um, I think about the listener a lot. Um, b and I'm constantly thinking about what I'm doing able to clearly communicate my intention, um, what to the listener. Now, I'm not necessarily interested in is it done in the most conventional and accessible way that
Yeah.
they will immediately understand it once they
Yeah.
listen to it. That I'm not as interested. What I am interested in is once they start noticing and putting together the pieces of the puzzle, do they realize that this every single aspect of the music was trying to deliver a message and carefully constructed, and that I am interested in. That's just the type of composer that I am.
Yeah.
So that I am interested in. It doesn't have to be the most like accessible, like, but it can be weird, but is it purposefully?
Yeah.
And for me at least, it tends to I tend to care about it more when it's purposeful, because I guess it had a purpose, it served a purpose, right? Like
Yeah.
it meant something more in my life when I
So,
had more purpose to it.
yeah. So, McLuhan says everything we invent extends some humanness, human sensorium. Knife and fork extends our teeth. Shutter in a camera extends our eyelid. Maybe even non-tangible, say religion or philosophy, extends consciousness. Two tools you use: the pen to write music or the keyboard, and the piano. What humanness does the piano extend for you?
Well, the piano, it actually expresses ideas and connections and patterns that I cannot create in my consciousness alone without the piano. And like,
Yeah.
especially as a jazz improviser, like I've gotten to the point that I can create a lot of different melodies, jazz
Yeah.
improvisational melodies off the cuff. But, and I think the music tends to sound better when what you're playing on the piano accords more with your imagination, right?
Yeah.
But there is always an element of something else emerges when you're actually playing the piano, and the tactile actual experience of playing the piano, and certain ideas your hand just likes better, and it might not be something that you might think of it might not be the nicest thing to think about, but it might be the nicest thing to play with your hand. Like, some things happen because it is on the piano, and certain limitations occur because it is the piano. Certain ideas that are easy to think of in my head, and I try to play it in the piano, it's like, what in the world? The piano can make it really difficult, because certain things are hard to do in the piano and certain
Yeah.
things are easier. And certain things that seem boring to my head, when you actually play it on the piano, is infinitely fun because it feels good, it's easy. So
Yeah.
it depends on, yeah, the piano opens a whole nother world of ideas, like
What does
like we're talking about, tools create new environments.
what's the in the pen extend? When you write music, you use a pen or a keyboard? I mean,
Usually I'm
typing.
usually I'm writing it on the piano first. Usually
You're
I write
writing,
it.
and then when you use the tool of putting it on paper,
Yeah.
you know, metaphorically,
Yeah. Yeah.
what tool you use?
I use Dorico now that Finale died. Um
Right, right. So what is that? Is that that's a computerized system
Yeah,
to
it's like a notation software. And
no,
usually I
notation software? What does notation software extend? What humanness?
communication. It extends the ability to communicate with other musicians.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's what it is for me, because primarily my music I write on the piano, recorded on my phone, and different ideas, and I have a coherent idea of how it all works, and I can
yeah,
play it on the piano. But I don't put it on paper until I have to perform it with other musicians at a concert, and I have to be like, okay, I have to communicate it. But the other interesting thing is, though, even though that's my primary purpose, but because now we have the medium of paper, different meanings can now arise because it's a paper. So a song that I wrote, it's called DMZ Blues, and that's coming on a new album too. But that song, I use two different chords that are supposed to be dissonant from each other, like North and South Korea are at the DMZ, at the demilitarized zone. North and South Korean soldiers are staring at each other the whole time, and that's one of the few places where North and South Koreans can coexist regularly all the time. So there's a weird dissonance there. So I try to use chords that are dissonant. But the other thing is that there's an element of creativity that only the performers who are reading the music or the sheet music will um see, which is that instead of naming the different sections as we usually do in jazz as A, B, and C, I actually name it, give it like a political meaning. Like this is the propaganda section. This
Wow,
is so
that's
you know, so that's a different meaning. Now the audience will never see that, but the performers will, and they'll
yeah,
think about
that's
it and they'll be like,
you know,
the heck?
Eric Satie puts on a notation, play like a nightingale with a toothache. You know this one, a woman taught me this 2 weeks ago. Stockhausen has a note and he says, "Play this note and don't think. Don't
Yeah.
think when you play this note." It's like, yeah, right.
That's a pretty good instruction, honestly.
I like that. I mean,
Yeah.
Stockhausen's good. But, Alfred, I asked for 90 minutes. We're already, uh, got 90 minutes. I wanna do a part 2 if you're willing, so we can get deeper into music. But
Sure.
can you go a little longer now, or do you wanna just, do a
Yeah,
part 2?
I think I can go for like 15 minutes or so. I do have
Okay,
to
let's go
get going.
let's go 15 more minutes. That would be perfect for me. What's the function of music?
Wow, that's a hard question. Now, there are conventional functions that we can, point to that are
Yeah,
obvious, right? Like, we use it and to feel good and all this. But I think when you're talking about function, you're talking about something usually people are talking about something bigger. Like, is there like a bigger function to music? And that I do not have a good or like a coherent answer to, but I prefer it to be that way because I don't think music has a function in that way.
yeah,
I don't think music is a function. I think music is an expression, right?
yeah,
And it can function as different things, but
yeah,
because it is a fundamental, like it is not fundamentally a function. It can be functional, but
yeah.
it's not a function. It's an expression. So because it is an expression, yeah, I try not
No,
to
that
think of it as
there
function.
there's a couple great things there. That artist I referred to, Duggo, said, "Art isn't." And that's like Stravinsky gave lectures that music means nothing. And it's not that it can be used as something, because Mickey
Right.
Hart of the Dead wrote the book and he said the first music was guys hitting logs to tell you that there's someone was coming to steal your food.
Yeah.
So it was functioning as a warning system. My friend said, no, the function of music is to dance. And Cage said that he learned from his teacher that the function of music is to soothe the soul and make it susceptible for divine intervention. So,
Yeah.
whatever that means, that's like, something a little deeper.
Yeah.
It's an amazing thing. So the Copeland says the four elements or ingredients of music are melody, harmony, rhythm, and tone color. In non-academic terms, what is tone color to the normal person on the street?
Tone color. It's really talking about mostly well, we're talking about timbre, right? You
But
can
that's
talk
a term. Timbre is a term they might not know. Like if you were
yeah.
trying to explain melody, harmony, and rhythm, you could kind of
I
the
think it's
character. Yes.
personality.
Yeah.
That's usually what we're talking about. Because
How
the most obvious is like the voice. Does that person have a rough voice, a
yeah,
smooth voice? It's
yeah.
it's texture, it's quality,
Text,
it's
texture.
character. Yeah.
Yeah, very good. Now, how do you, and I'm always struggling with this question, maybe you can help me. How do I ask people, how do you integrate, focus? Do you favor one of those four? Most people go, no, I use all four of them equally. Some people go, no, I'm a rhythm person first. But how do you integrate melody, harmony, rhythm, and tone color? Is there a prioritizing you have? Is there a I need the verb. How do you integrate is the best verb I've come
Yeah.
up with. There's
Well,
some kind of verb I'm searching for, like, how do you juggle those 4?
yeah. Well, I think of it more like this. I mean, and I think you already said it. Like, I'll give you an easy answer and a and a
Yeah.
more complex answer. The easy
Yeah.
answer is like you said, it's always all four happening at the same time.
Yeah.
Just like you're breathing, blinking your eyes, and and sitting at the same time.
Yeah.
Those all always have to be operative usually in most of the art forms or forms of music we're doing for it to be musical, right? But the more complex answer, and I think this is the more interesting answer, is it depends. What you're talking about is that, because as someone who actually has now experienced music professionally for several years, um what I've noticed is that different contexts make different things more important. You
Yeah.
know, for example, when I'm as a jazz musician, when I was before I became a regular performing artist in academia, what do you think is the most important? It's harmony. It's chords.
Oh,
It's harmony. In academia, it's harmony for jazz because um that's the part of music that can be put into books and into documentation the easiest compared to rhythm. Rhythm is harder to put into, like, for example, like a really simple rhythm. That's really easy for someone to
yeah.
clap back. But if you write it down on notation, that's a little harder, right? Whereas harmony is a lot easier when you notate it out on the paper as
Yeah.
opposed to hearing it, because it's a lot of information. So harmony is inherently academic. But as someone who actually started performing jazz a lot, rhythm, I realize, is way more important to this music than harmony. But then as a composer, as you can tell, I'm like a philosophy guy. And the particular way I compose, it's not harmony, it's not rhythm, it's not tone color, it's not lyrics, it's text. And what I mean by text is the idea for me is the most important. Like, for example, if I'm talking about the outside of a woman, it's the notion of outsideness.
Yeah.
And everything else is the color on the palette that I'm trying
Yeah.
to paint that idea with. But as a performer in a band, yeah, rhythm for jazz, rhythm is king.
Yeah.
Where in an academia, harmony. In a pub when I was a teenager, or not a pub, when I was a teenager, hanging out with my friends, it was melody.
Wow.
When I'm an audience in a listening to music, tone color. When I'm a mixer, tone color becomes really
Dude,
important.
you
You know what I
broke
mean?
that down. You broke that down better than anybody. I was so appreciative because, here's the next. We'll do two more questions and then we'll go to part two. But look at the three elements my friend said of music are technique, theory, and taste. The three T's. Technique, you learned how to play it. Theory, you know the structure. How does one acquire taste?
Taste. Wow. You know, uh, I think taste is a story. Just like, because the self, who you are, is a story. It's the
Yeah,
retrospective linking of all these disparate experiences and disregarding certain experiences, which is very important to creating who you are, is ignoring most of your experience and discerning which experiences are important and worthwhile for your story of life. Because I am not counting the experience of my leg, um, you know, touching this desk right now, because
yeah,
that's not deemed as important, even though I'm spending a lot more time doing this than I would, I don't know, a fun video I watch on YouTube, an educational video that takes me 10 minutes. This I have been doing for an hour and a half. It doesn't
yeah,
matter though, right? It's all interpretation. It's retrospective. And taste is kind of the same process, right? It's that process of determining what matters in that story, in your story. And it's I think fundamentally linked with yourself, who of your image, not just an image, but what constitutes you as a person. And taste is that is it follows that same process of sorting through that, all of that information that you have had throughout your life, and determining which ones are important. Now, that's a pretty, like, that's kind of an abstract, I think it's correct, but it's an abstract analysis of taste. Now the more personal dive into taste, it's, I think it's what you can't forget.
Wow.
It's that which you cannot forget, which is related to what I'm talking about. It's not my leg brushing past this desk for an hour. It's that
Yeah.
book you read that you spent much less time, or just a sentence from a book that you can't forget. It's that which you can't forget. That's what taste is. That's what you are too.
Yeah, no, Alfred, you're really deeper, because most people say experience exposure. Well, I know you get taste from what was played around you and
Right.
what you hear, but you took it another level. It's defining your story, discerning your story,
Yeah.
retrospective. I really appreciate that. Now, here's the follow-up. McLuhan said, song is slowed down speech. The reason cultures have different musical taste is ultimately connected to language difference.
Um, I it depends on what you mean by language. If you're talking about the difference between Spanish and French and English and Spanish, or something like actual languages, I wouldn't say so, because I think, the actual linguistic political structure that we live in is global in nature. Like capitalism is global, for example. Like a lot of the realities, um and just look at the internet, people like the same thing a lot of the times. But if we're talking about music as a language, which I increasingly do, especially as a jazz musician, music, yeah, it does determine a lot of how you think about language, your view on language, that or of this language called music. What kind of like if you're a classical musician and you look at the language of music as it's kind of like a Shakespeare recitation, is what a lot of classical musicians relationship to the language of music is, that it's more like a classical recitation of Shakespeare. It's memorized, you pretty much say, recite Shakespeare. um Most classical musicians, not everybody. There are a lot of, a lot of people break from that, but most of that's what we're talking about. Whereas for most jazz musicians, the music, the language called music, is more speech like, in that, it's not nonsense. We're not just saying whatever we want with music. It's communicative, but it's not determined. We improvise, we say things. Whereas if you're someone who's like a dance musician, like a disco musician, the language of your music, the purpose of it is to make people dance, right? Whereas for jazz music, it's to speak. For um classical musicians, it's to interpret well, you know and for pop musicians, it's to disseminate to the most people, as many people as possible. For it all depends on what pool, or what your view of that language like even within jazz. Like, let's talk about taste. Like, a lot of jazz musicians have a particular idea of what jazz needs to sound like, because that's what they've been told is what jazz is. That's what
Yeah,
they've come to understand, that what jazz is, right? And
yeah,
that fundamental and that so all the other jazz that contradicts that is not jazz. It's forgettable. But all the jazz that corresponds to that view, they can't forget it.
yeah.
It stays with them. I have a different view of jazz, because I came to jazz much later, and I already had an idea of what my definition of music is. But yeah, but
You're
I don't want
talking,
to.
yeah,
Yeah,
Alfred, you're talking. I mean, how I think there's certain artists, Duchamp, Cecil Taylor, Jackson Pollock. When Cecil Taylor hit, there's nobody post Cecil. I know there are, and I know who he came out of, Herbie Nichols and blah, blah, blah. But
right.
to me, it was like, Cecil's like that. That's it. He did it,
Yeah.
And some people go, no, that's bullshit. And I say, okay. Or like Sun Ra was visited backstage after a show, and the guy goes, my kid could play that. And Sun Ra went, but can he transcribe it? but you know what I'm saying, because there's two things you evoked at this, music, different musical taste is ultimately connected to language difference. Because when Brazilian jazz hit America in the 60s, it was romantic. We didn't necessarily know the words. It was maybe how Brazilians talked, and they translated that into another form. One
Yeah.
other thing, and that is we learned studying, we interviewed John Hendricks, the great, one of the great vocalese jazz,
Right. Yeah.
singers.
Mhm.
I mean, who invented vocalese? Well, he said he was working in the hotel where Art Tatum was the pianist, and he would just sit there in awe of him, and he would say, "Sing this," to John Hendricks. So that's how he developed vocalese,
Right.
by Art Tatum running these riffs that were almost unsingable, and
Right.
he learned it. But here's the follow-up to end part one, and it's really been a treat, Alfred. I appreciate how concise and articulate you are,
Thank
and
you.
I'm here to have fun, and I've had a lot of fun with you. What is more fundamental, language or music?
Language.
Wow!
Language. I'm sorry.
You're sorry. Don't be sorry.
No, I'm sorry because because I know a lot of musician friends.
They would say music, yeah.
They would say music, but as someone, I got to be honest with myself. As
Yeah,
it's language.
yeah,
It's language.
yeah.
Yeah, you can't have music without language.
That's amazing, because that's a question that came up recently that I don't think I invented it, but it's very interesting. And it's, did humans start to imitate the birds or whatever, the sounds of the forest or
Mhm.
whatever, and create music? Or did the birds imitate the humans? Now,
Well,
go
yeah.
ahead. Yeah.
What I would say is this: is that I do believe that we don't have evidence of this because this is so far in the past.
Yeah.
Maybe we made harmonious sounds before language.
Yeah.
But what we mean by music, usually what we're talking about is a system. And
Is
that
a system.
system, it's a
Yeah.
system. What's what
Yeah.
we're talking. We're not talking about just imitation because then, you know, maybe some people might say birds are singing and there's music
Yeah.
in birds, but we're not talking about the same thing. That's not the
Yeah.
same thing as jazz.
Yeah.
They're similar elements, but it's a system, and a
Yeah.
system happens in language, right?
Yeah.
And that's what I'm talking about. Is that yeah? I mean, we might have had harmonious sounds imitating birds and felt and repeated it again and again and felt good about it. And maybe that was proto music, and maybe proto
Yeah.
music even preceded language. But
Yeah.
this particular system that has concretized and been passed down throughout history, this doesn't seem like language which created everything, which created
Yeah.
philosophy, which created history, which created
Yeah.
logic, which created mathematics, in my opinion too, is yeah, there's no way language music can't be no it
Yeah.
all of
But
these systems can only exist after language. Yeah.
we know that that could have been, that animals could have heard humans and imitated them, because we know that parrots sometimes imitate. It
Yeah.
doesn't sound like it would have happened like the animals were around first. But
Yeah, I mean, yeah, you know.
but it is funny, proto music, to think that you know uh uh there's some communication between animals, and we're hearing it like Messiaen. I was going to tell you in closing, Ben Sidran was interviewing Sun Ra. It's
Mm.
probably on it's VH1, or so. It's probably on YouTube, but it's a long time ago. And he said, "So you worked with Fletcher Henderson. Did he influence you?" And Sun Ra went, "No, the birds and the crickets influence me." And that's the same thing. We know Eric Dolphy right here in central LA would go out in the middle of the night and listen to the crickets.
Yeah.
And his solos are so amazing. You wonder, where did he get this from? you know? And so it is, a phenomenon of like
I
cross.
think I would say this last. Musicality existed before music,
Yeah,
but music only existed after we were able to retrospectively label all of these sounds and put them into a system and call it music.
yeah,
I think that's
yeah,
how I think about it. Musicality, things that we now
yeah,
deem as musical, we probably did for a long time,
yeah,
but we probably didn't call it music.
yeah. That's like your use of words is deep because you've studied all these great philosophers and how they use words. And McLuhan said all words are metaphorical. So
Yeah.
if all words are metaphorical, then what's the word literal a metaphor for?
That's a deep question.
Yeah, we'll explore it in
Deep
part two.
question.
We'll explore it in part two. Alfred, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time and energy and all your music. And even though I'm going to hit the end broadcast button, I hope this never ends and we can keep talking forever and ever. Thank you so
Yeah,
much.
thanks for having me. I enjoyed it very much too.
Okay. Bye. Thanks.
Right.